How's it going? Great, great.
Are a lot of you Slack users?
Oh,
How many of you have multiple Slacks? Because I do. Nice.
awesome. I love it. Thank you.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that one of the things that Julia's team tracks at Slack is how quickly you can like switch between channels, and maybe I imagine between teams as well. So if there's ever
Absolutely.
like, one day you wake up and it's really slow, like she's probably already on it, but you could feel free to ping her and be like, hey, about that. Well, anyway, thanks for sitting in on the session. So as a little background, I mean, you have been at Slack for how long now? It's been a few years.
2.5 years.
Yeah.
And I've seen us triple in size in that time.
Right. And yeah, one of the things about Slack that's, I think, people have been interested in seeing is just how quickly it's grown, both in terms of users as well as employees, which is, and I don't know if they said you're director of infrastructure engineering, right? Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Sure.
we're gonna
All right.
begin the dance routine. Just kidding.
I'm on this side. All right. Well, so that maybe we can start from the beginning. You were actually, your first experience sort of working with Slack was outside of the company building integrations with the service, right? So you can just tell us a little bit like what kind of things were available to you then, that was many years ago, and what's different now? You're on the
So
other side.
before 2.5 years ago, before I joined, I had started a startup e-commerce space. And right after Slack came out of beta, we started using it on my team. I had built an engineering team. We had people in marketing and customer support. And it totally transformed how we ran the business. And so this was long before I ever thought about working at the company. I'm an engineer by trade, and I started building integrations on top of the Slack platform. And this was about 4.5 years ago. So I start building integrations. I'm sending a lot of data into Slack about a lot of our internal systems. And so I'm loving the APIs, building things. I even went on the Product Hunt podcast, and I was talking about how I use Slack, how I was trying to migrate some of my workflows off of email, the same with my engineering team. So we end up selling the company. Story for another time. And I'm thinking about what do I want to do next. So I spend a few months, I talk to a lot of different companies, I look at all the apps on my home screen, because those are the services that I use most frequently. And right there in the middle, in the center is Slack. And so I start talking to Slack, I end up joining, and I begin my career there on the platform team, because again, that's the team building all of the APIs, working with developers. I used to be on the other side of the table, so I've switched now inside, and I'm working on a lot of the, again, APIs that maybe, hopefully, some of you are building on top of.
Right, and so then talk a little bit about the size of the engineering team as well as the size of platform or infrastructure when you joined, and then where it is now, and what has some of that change been like, sort of more from a managerial perspective.
So when I interviewed at Slack in August of 2015, and I got a job offer, they said, we don't have anyone for you to manage, but don't worry, we're going to hire some people, and you can manage them. And I was like, sounds great. Like, I'm in. So I joined in October. I'm managing a small team of front-end engineers. How many of you in the audience are engineers? Rock and roll. So one of the interesting experiences that I had early in my time there was I am very much so a back-end engineer. And the role that they hired me for was front-end management. They're like, you're going to hire front-end, and you're going to manage front-end engineers. And like, I know enough JavaScript to be dangerous, but I'm by no means a front-end engineer. And so it was a really fantastic way to really ramp up fast on management, because I couldn't do the job my engineering team did. I really had to learn and support them. So I start managing them. My team grows from 3 to 8 to 10. Then we hire another manager. I'm managing that manager. Year and a half later, we form an infrastructure team. 12 people assembled across the company. I'm running infrastructure. We're now over 50 people on infrastructure. So we've gone from 12 to 50 people in 18 months. So that's been a really awesome and wild ride.
Yeah, and the total engineering team was like 100 when you joined, and maybe 350 now.
You got it.
Yeah. And so then talk a little bit more about you said sort of, is there a rule of thumb of like how many direct reports and at what point do you need to start hiring managers of managers, and how do you know, like, how do you know when that is the time, and it maybe never seems like the right time, but.
So a lot of the things that I struggled with in my startup days were, what size of an engineering team do you have when you need to hire your first manager? Maybe you have a co-founder who's very technical and they're managing the team, but in the early days of startups, everyone is usually coding and building, and that was always how it was in my 2 previous startup experiences, all smaller scale startups. Now, usually when you get in the 8 to 10 to 12 person range, there starts to be a large amount of work around ensuring the team is all pointed in the same direction and moving together, that the team has clear prioritization, clear understanding of the goals. I often like to talk about with your teams, it's so important to know what you're not working on in addition to what you're working on. So that's about the time that we began to bring in that first level of management, was in that 8 to 12 range. On infrastructure right now, we try to cap the number of direct reports around 10. Since the company is so large, there's so much cross-functional communication and coordination we have to do. As Ellen mentioned, infrastructure is around 50 people, but there's 350 in engineering. So we're working with a lot of other teams. So at that point, right now, I have 3 teams with 3 managers leading them. And then it's pretty simple math. So each of those managers has about 10 direct reports. I have several individual contributors who report to me, and then I have people in a few other functions who report into me. And so you can really scale. I'm trying to keep the organization flat. The higher up you go, the more difficult scaling communication is, so you want to keep those levels pretty small. But I would say if you're getting over 15 direct reports, you're not spending a lot of time with your direct reports, and that can be something that can be very tricky to handle.
Yeah, and when you talked also about, now that you have more layers, and then your job as a director, and there's 5 other directors in engineering, right, is part of what you're doing is communicating horizontally, as you said. So not just up nor down, but going side to side. And a lot of that, I imagine, is coordination on, priorities and what people are working on. So like, are there particular strategies that you guys have picked up as the engineering team has gotten a lot bigger to keep people in line?
So how many of you are managers? Okay, so it looks like from the number of hands raised, maybe 15%. How many of you have a manager right now? Okay, so only about 15, so the rest of you are living the dream. You're working for yourself, you've got no boss. That sounds pretty awesome. So let's see. One of the interesting things about management is that a lot of us, the 85% who are not living the dream with no boss, we have managers, and we're very familiar with this dynamic of you have a manager and how do you communicate with them. So when someone first becomes a manager, the first things that they do is they over-index on communicating down, because that's the only way that they've known a manager-direct report relationship. So they're very focused on the team, ensuring the team has what they need, that people are learning and growing. But they often neglect managing sideways, and they really struggle in the art of managing up. And so the higher up that you go, the more communication becomes incredibly important, and you have to learn how do you manage sideways? How do you talk to your peers in that remote, far-off part of the organization that might even live in another building? So what we've done is we've set up a lot of channels and meeting check-in cadences with some of the people on the furthest teams to ensure that we're still very well aligned. And that's something I coach a lot of those first-time managers on how to do. And then there's a whole other section about how do you manage up. Steve Sinofsky, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, has written a great piece about management where he talks about the down, sideways, and up elements. If you go to his Medium blog, I highly recommend that post.
Yeah, actually, he's a great person to follow on Twitter. I'm a big fan. And one thing that I'm also kind of curious about in terms of management, and maybe something to think about for those who are founders here, is something you mentioned to me earlier about how people tend to succeed when they have maybe similar values or personality traits as those who are at the top of a company. This was a piece of advice you got, right?
Yeah, so I remember 11 years ago, so it was 2007. I had just finished my graduate work in computer science in North Carolina, and I was talking with my graduate advisor, and she had spent over 40 years at IBM, and this was really at a fantastic time for IBM. She had become a fellow, which is the highest level that you can get to there. And I was about to, pack up all my bags, head west to this wild place called Silicon Valley. I was about to go work for IBM Research. I spent 5 years at IBM Research. Some of the most fascinating, great work I've done. And so I asked her, I say, Diane, you've worked at this company for 40 years. How do you be successful? Tell me all of your secrets. So the thing that she told me that really stuck with me was that when you join an organization, look at your boss, look at if it's a startup, the CEO, if it's a bigger company, maybe that's the VP you work under. Look at the leaders. The attributes that they display will be the attributes that are rewarded in the organization. So what does that mean? Let's say that the VP is very aggressive. Aggressive people likely might be rewarded and be promoted faster in the organization than people who are less aggressive. If the person's an introvert, introverts might be more successful. Now, it takes a very, very self-aware manager to understand how to manage that complex dynamic of not just promoting people who look like you and act like you. So I think about that a lot. I think about a lot with respect to building my organization and ensuring people of all backgrounds, of many different attributes can be successful.
And do you think about how much do you feel like you change sort of how you present yourself to your team in order to make sure everyone feels comfortable about, if they are different from you, relating to you in that way?
So a lot of the things I think a lot about the higher up that you go, and the louder your voice is. I don't have an inside voice. The more your words can be taken very seriously. Like, there's a very big difference between confidence and competence. But often people who are more confident come across as more competent. So I'm very careful in meetings to spend a lot of time listening, asking people who look like they're about to speak up but never have, getting them to participate in the discussion, following up afterward. If there are people who looked like they wanted to participate but didn't feel comfortable, to ensure I'm creating an environment where they can feel like they can voice their opinion and be heard.
What are some of the things, one of the things that we also talked about that I thought was great was, as Slack has matured, you guys have 6 million daily users now, right?
Yep.
It becomes obviously more complicated to handle some of the traffic needs of Slack. And in particular, dealing with outages. I thought you had like a really interesting way of explaining sort of what happens, and why it can sometimes be difficult to handle connectivity issues with Slack. Although the goal is to be up all the time.
All the time, every day, 24/7 around the world. Absolutely. So let's nerd out a little bit together here today. Some of you woke up. That was awesome. So I think people often the majority of users have Slack open for 10 hours a day. Now, they're not necessarily sending messages for 10 hours a day. They might just have it passively open. Notifications might be coming in, new channels are getting created. We're sending a lot of information back and forth across from clients to servers and back about what's going on so that we can let you know as soon as possible if you get that DM from your boss so that you'll know to immediately respond, or that urgent channel that gets created where you're thinking like, oh my goodness. So now, one of the consequences of having a service where people are connected a lot of the time is that there are very rare occurrences where large amounts of people connect to the service. So let's unpack that and let me give you a better example. So since most people leave Slack open, leave it passively connected, they're very rarely closing the application and then starting it up from zero. So when you close Slack and you reopen it, we need to send you a lot of information. Let's say you've closed it for just 5 minutes. There may not be that much to send. Maybe you went on awesome vacation where you didn't even check Slack or check any internet, and it's been a week, and we need to send you a lot of data. So that initial load time when you start the application, we're sending you that fire hose of data. Now, every so often, when you're building software, occasionally there are bugs. We have a lot of tooling, we have a lot of tests, we do everything that we can to ensure that we don't have bugs, but we're building a complex system in a complex world. There are unknown unknowns, things happen. So occasionally, if we have a bug in the system that disconnects a large number of users, what happens then is a lot of users need to come back online. Sometimes this happens at 8 a.m. on Monday mornings. We've got a lot of large corporations that use Slack. Some of them have up to 35,000 people using Slack. And so Monday mornings, we'll see what we call a large reconnection, a thundering herd. A lot of people are connecting. That puts a lot of load on our services. Now, if we have a bug that disconnects a lot of people, let's say it disconnects everyone. It disconnects 6 million people. What happens after we get the service back online? 6 million people, at most, will try to reconnect. Now, that's a huge amount of load. And so one of the things we've had to design is that we now handle, on an average day, we're seeing about 3.5 million people connected at peak, but we need to be able to handle twice that traffic in case anything happens and there's this connection. So an analogy would be Amazon getting ready for holiday season. Well, we need to be ready at all times in case there's a large reconnection. Now, here's an interesting thing though, Ellen. Sometimes these reconnections are caused by bugs in our software. Sometimes they happen because internet service providers will experience blips around the world, and all of Singapore might be disconnected. And all of Singapore needs to come back online, and we need to be able to handle that, and we never know when it's going to happen. And so this is the mantra of infrastructure, is we are behind the scenes, we're building these systems so that if anything ever happens, you come back online quickly and rapidly, and if we do our job well, you never know we exist.
I have another question, but we'll do Q&A after that, so if people have questions, you can start thinking now. I also loved hearing about the sort of the evolution of some of the things that you guys are working on at infrastructure at Slack, such as like sort of low connectivity or kind of the things, all these wonderful things that I as the user am never going to notice except when they go wrong, obviously. But talk to me about some of the like second order things that you have this ability to handle all the traffic you need, but what are some of the other things tips and tricks that you guys are considering to kind of make Slack work even better?
So Slack was originally designed for users that had fast internet. And this was the early days when Slack was predominantly used by small and medium businesses for smaller teams. Now that we're used by corporations around the world, we have a very large customer that runs a huge call center in India. And at that call center, those individuals use a Slack integration as almost their punch card to say, all right, I'm logging on. They accept calls, they handle call volume, like they do it all through Slack. And so we have to ensure that we are performant and reliable around the world. Now, as we're moving into different markets, some of those markets do not have the internet speeds that we might experience here. Sometimes in downtown San Francisco, there's some questionable internet speeds. So we want you as our customers, thank you to everyone who raised your hand. We want you to be able to use Slack all the time, regardless if you're on LTE, you're on fast wireless, or maybe you're in here and you're on like 3G. Now, there's a lot of implications and a lot of changes that we've been making behind the scenes so that you can access messages, access channels, potentially send in really low internet situations. Now, I remember that we discussed earlier that fire hose of data, like we're sending you data. So as the infrastructure organization, we've really been behind the scenes optimizing and tuning the amount of data that we send to you so that we don't have to send as much for you to still be online, for you to be connected, for you to receive notifications that people are sending you messages. And so an example of this would be, there are companies that upload a lot of files. For example, we have a customer that has a lot of workers that are out in the field. And when they're out in the field, they're taking pictures and uploading those pictures to Slack, and they're uploading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images a day. And so we need, and they're often out in remote areas in low connectivity. So we need to make sure that the file upload speeds for those folks are really fast. And let me tell you, if you build your infrastructure for low internet connectivity, it's lightning fast when you have really fast internet. So it's been this interesting learning of optimizing for when people might be borderline online, offline. I'm on Caltrain 2 hours a day with a MiFi, and so I live and feel the pain. And so if you build for that use case, the rest of your users reap huge benefits.
Awesome. Do we want to do, does anyone have a question that they want to, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we can take a few.
The critical demand, to meet those critical demands and that cavalcade and the fire hose that goes out, means you have to maybe make some concessions on critical components, like acquiring new customers. So do you guys find it necessary to outsource your billing, or do you have your billing system on-prem to be able to support the surge of new signups? You have information going in, information going out. It's a big railroad switch. Want to know how you make those concessions if you need to.
So when you say billing, do you mean building or billing?
Sorry, I mean billing. So when new users sign up, is that something that you take on, or do you offload that?
We take that on.
Okay.
So we have whole teams that are all around, structured around understanding new users, optimizing sign up. Here, let me give you an example. The new sign-up flow for how you acquire and onboard users at small companies and small startups is vastly different at large companies. At large companies, they're often provisioning the software. They have an IT organization that already has apps set up for you. They have lists of apps that the organization already uses. And so we definitely think about these audiences and their nuance in very different ways. And it's always an interesting balance to figure out what are the common themes and then what are areas where we need to specialize in the small business unit, for example, versus enterprise and large enterprise. Thank you.
Hi, I'm very fascinated by what Slack did before they started developing Slack and until they developed it and they did the beta testing. What they did to match the customer satisfaction. I know you weren't there at that time, but do you know what strategies Slack followed to perfectly meet the customer satisfaction?
So I think your question is around, we always stay very close to customers. So what does that mean? For my team to be successful, engineers are deploying and writing code every day, all day long. The more information they have about how the customers are using the product, they will then make better decisions. Every line of code you write, you are making decisions. And so we have a very large and incredibly impressive customer support team that is around the world monitoring things like Twitter, the tickets that are going in. If you ever have feedback on the product, /feedback, we're pulling in all of these different sources. And then we've got processes internally to ensure that we're routing any potential, for example, engineering bugs to the right location, or, for example, password resets. Like, that's a very large ticket volume. We've always tried to be very customer-centric, customer-first. We want to ensure that we're providing a very, very high level of service. And that ultimately came from our CEO, Stuart Butterfield, in the early days, and Ali Rail, one of the earliest employees who now runs our very large customer support organization. So I think it ultimately comes from the DNA of those founders, and then it trickles down throughout the organization.
Cool. Any question here in the back?
There's a lady.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. This probably is a question more for your time on the front end side, but as a productivity tool, how do you think about the difference between what might be considered a business need of, let's say, engagement, and all the ways that as a technology tool you get people to use your product, versus the reality of the fact is, if everyone was working and not on your product, they'd be much more productive. And how do you manage that just in your thinking and in your design process?
Yeah, so it's a good question about with enterprise software, we don't go around and brag about how much time we spend in PowerPoint. And so ideally, Slack, I'm trying to think about the best way to phrase it. So at large companies, there's a lot of tools that you use every day to get your job done. If you're an engineer, maybe it's GitHub and it's your continuous integration service. If you're in sales, maybe it's Salesforce. If you're in HR, it's the applications you're using to log time off or expense reports. And so the thought is, if you've got a way to quickly and easily communicate and organize information, and you've got also a tool, hey, Slack, that integrates with all of these other tools that you use. Maybe you can't do your full expense report in Slack, but you can do a subset of the things you do, and you don't have to log into all these other tools. You don't have to context switch. You can do it all in one place. Then we like to think that makes your life better, and you're not necessarily spending all your time in the tool, but you're just using one tool to then connect you to everything else that you need to do. And so sometimes, there are teams that have very low message volume, and that's a very healthy team. Other teams, maybe teams that have customer support where they're doing a lot of messaging back and forth, they might have very, very high message volumes, and that's a really healthy team. So ultimately, we want to make people's working lives better, more simpler, and more productive. And in some ways, that's fading into the background. And in other use cases, it's really coming into the foreground. But it's a very delicate balance. And we want to ensure we're providing value and not yet another tool.
Cool. I think that's all the time we have for today. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry. I would have liked to get more questions. But I just want to say thank you all for coming to the panel. Julia has said that if you have questions for her, you should feel free to find her on Twitter. If for whatever reasons you have questions for me, I'm there as well. Thanks so much, and I guess we'll be moving on to the next session.
Thank you, everybody.